Well, good afternoon. I suspect that, like most people, you know 8 things about Abraham Lincoln. Number 1, he was born in a log cabin and grew up poor. Number 2, he married Mary Todd, who was somewhat crazy and looked like a dumpy version of Sally Field. Number 3, he spent most of his adult life in Springfield, Illinois. Number 4, he gained national prominence debating Stephen Douglas before he ran for president. Number 5, the Civil War monopolized his presidency. Number 6, in mid-war he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Number 7, his Gettysburg Address and second inaugural address are regarded by most as the 2 most eloquent speeches in American history. Number 8, last but not least, John Wilkes Booth assassinated him at Ford's Theater shortly after the Civil War ended. Now these 8 points, known by all of you, and you've probably known them since you were in grade school, make up the skeleton of Lincoln's life. But today, in the next few minutes, I want to put meat on the bones and bring Lincoln alive. And to do that, I want to cover 3 areas of his life that you probably didn't know when you came to the Tower meeting today. And those are 3 things that led him to become our greatest American hero. First, here's something you probably don't know about Lincoln's early years. That is, from the time he was a young boy until he left home, Abraham Lincoln had a totally dysfunctional relationship with his father, Tom. Tom Lincoln was a sub-mediocre carpenter and farmer who drifted with his family from Kentucky to Indiana to Illinois, was always in dire poverty, and lacked even a semblance of ambition. One neighbor described Tom as a perfect example of poor white trash. He was also illiterate, and he abhorred anyone who could read or write. And that caused real problems in the Lincoln home, because as a child, Abraham Lincoln loved reading more than anything, because he believed reading was the key to opening up a successful life. So instead of encouraging his son to read, Tom was known to throw away Abe's books because he wanted Abe to grow up and spend all of his waking hours farming in the field, such that young Abe functioned essentially as his dad's indentured servant. When Abe finally left Tom's home in 1831, for the next 20 years until his dad's death, there's no record that they ever saw each other again or had any further communications. Now you may ask, why is that important? That Abe Lincoln had a hostile relationship with his father. How does that put meat on the bones of what made Abe Lincoln grow into the man he became? Well, here's the answer. History is filled with the story of boys who became men whose ambition was driven by the desire to exceed their father's achievements, allowing a son to justify to himself and to others that the path he had chosen in life was the right choice, and to have followed in his father's footsteps would have been the wrong choice. Besides Lincoln, historians agree that this desire to achieve way beyond what Dad did was certainly what drove Lyndon Johnson and Ronald Reagan out of their young adult life starting blocks, and it also inspired 39-year-old Theodore Roosevelt to join the Army and lead the Rough Riders up San Juan Hill to atone for his father's cowardice during the Civil War. And it was massive ambition, starting at a young age, that drove Abe Lincoln to overachieve. When he first ran for public office at age 23, Lincoln announced, quote, "Every man is said to have his peculiar ambition. I have no other so great as being truly esteemed by my fellow men, by rendering myself worthy of their esteem." Now, what went unsaid in that statement, but which Abe Lincoln surely thought at age 23, was, quote, "Unlike my father, my ambition is to be truly esteemed by my fellow men. And unlike my father, I want to render myself worthy of their esteem." Years later, his law partner William Herndon said, in describing Lincoln's ambition, that it was a little engine that knew no rest. Lincoln's unquenchable thirst to rise above the dire poverty of his childhood and aspire to do great things was fundamental to his personality, and it was driven, at least in part, by the desire to rise above his aimless, illiterate, and harsh father. Now, the second thing about Lincoln you probably don't know, but which puts meat on the bones, pertains to his 23 years as a practicing lawyer. Yes, I know, you already know that while he lived in Springfield, he was a lawyer. But what you probably don't know is that he was a spectacular lawyer, a virtuoso, who pushed himself to the limit and became one of the most respected trial and appellate attorneys in his part of the country during the 1840s and 50s. Here are some facts which help paint the picture of Lincoln the super lawyer. First, in his legal career, Abe tried over 1,000 jury trials to verdict, meaning he averaged almost one jury trial every week for over 20 years. 26 of our 44 American presidents have been lawyers. Abe Lincoln tried more cases than the other 25 combined. Next, Lincoln's achievements in his trial work were matched by his success as an appellate lawyer. He argued over 400 cases to the Illinois Supreme Court and even argued one case to the United States Supreme Court. Next, because Springfield in Lincoln's time had less than 5,000 people, in order to generate income year-round, Lincoln traveled the circuit for 6 months out of every year in the 17 counties around Springfield. Finally, in addition to his skill and work ethic, Abe built a sterling professional reputation throughout Illinois because he had an unusual trait for a trial lawyer. That is, he favored and pursued settlement of his cases over the risk and costs of going to trial. Famously, he once told a group of young lawyers that they should, quote, discourage litigation. Persuade your neighbors to compromise whenever you can. Point out to them that the nominal winner is often a real loser in fees, expenses, and waste of time, close quote. Yes, Lincoln tried over 1,000 jury trials, but only as a last resort, after all hope for settlement had passed away. Meaning Lincoln practiced alternative dispute resolution over a century before our profession finally embraced it in the 1980s. So now that you know these specifics about Lincoln's legal career, again you may say, how does that put meat on the bones? To help us better understand what made Lincoln great. Here's my answer. Abe Lincoln did not become our most discerning and eloquent president by accident. Where did he get his capacity to make good decisions amidst complicated facts and people in conflict during the frenzied times of the Civil War? Because lawyer-turned-President Lincoln, as a thorough researcher, made sure he knew all the facts and the applicable law before making big-time war decisions that often push the envelope on our constitutional limits. Gathering complete information in the midst of conflict and analyzing law where there is no clear precedent is what great litigators do in handling trials and appeals. Where did he get his superior skills as a speaker and writer? Lincoln had unmatched communication skills as president because he used a powerful combination of logic, tone, rhetoric, imagery, metaphor, and storytelling, whether speaking broadly to the masses or privately to his cabinet, because that's what great lawyers do in making their arguments. They choose the right words and use the right tone to fit the particular audience, which causes what they say to have higher powers of clarity and persuasion. 5 years ago today, on Lincoln's 200th birthday here in Dallas, I got to spend the day with Pulitzer Prize-winning historian James McPherson from Princeton. That day I asked him, could Lincoln have accomplished all he did as commander-in-chief if he had not been a consummate lawyer? Dr. McPherson replied without hesitation, No way. His superior legal skills were essential to his successful leadership throughout the Civil War. Now, the third fact about Abraham Lincoln's life that you probably don't realize, but what empowered his great moral leadership of the country, was the breadth and depth of his faith in God, which expanded greatly during his years as president. Over the course of his life, like so many of us, Lincoln traveled a spiritual odyssey. As a child and adolescent, he rejected the hellfire and brimstone churches where his parents took him. Later, after leaving home during his tumultuous courtship with Mary Todd, Lincoln battled depression to such an extent that for a while he declared himself an infidel. But he turned the corner in his faith journey in 1850 after his second son Eddie died at age 3. Mary Todd Lincoln understandably grieved deeply over losing Eddie and could find solace only at the Presbyterian Church in Springfield. So for the next 10 years, until he became president, Abe joined her at that church every week he was in town, and the Presbyterian minister James Smith became Lincoln's first spiritual mentor. Spending a decade in Smith's church enhanced Lincoln's biblical perception of right and wrong and triggered his expanded role as the country's most persuasive voice against slavery's expansion into the Western territories. After becoming president in March 1861, Lincoln soon found a Presbyterian church in Washington, D.C., and there he found the second great spiritual mentor of his life, Phineas Gurney, who played a huge role in helping Lincoln overcome his grief when his beloved 11-year-old son, Willie, died in the White House in 1862. Later in 1862, after Willie's death, Lincoln told his cabinet about his plan to issue the Emancipation Proclamation and said it was something that he had to do because it would fulfill a commitment that Lincoln had made, quote, to my maker, close quote. 11 months after the Emancipation Proclamation issued, Lincoln ended his Gettysburg Address with his desire that, quote, this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, close quote. By March 1865, with the war's end in sight, Lincoln gave his second inaugural address, a speech historian Ronald White calls Lincoln's Sermon on the Mount, the one that ends with malice toward none, with charity for all. This masterpiece of an address contained only 703 words, meaning it's a little bit longer than a standard newspaper editorial. 703 words, and in it, Lincoln spoke the word God 14 times, quoted 4 separate and distinct scriptures, and invited the nation to pray not once, not twice, but 3 different places in the speech. And for his coup de grace, to cement his legacy as a spiritual leader, the final bill Lincoln signed into law the week before he died was the one which requires our American coins to bear the words, "In God we trust." So these are 3 aspects of Abraham Lincoln's life story you probably didn't know before this afternoon that hopefully strengthen your understanding of what it was that fueled his ambition, his talents, and his moral authority. First, a son disconnected from a hostile father. And this generational tension inspired Lincoln's ferocious ambition to leave behind his humble beginnings and fully develop his brilliant mind and rise above his childhood circumstances and go out into the world and be esteemed by his fellow men and make his mark on history. Next, a consummate trial and appellate lawyer whose 23 years of clear communication, thorough research, persuasive advocacy, and problem-solving dispute resolution gave him the skills necessary to bring our country through the Civil War. And finally, a person of deep and expanding faith in God, which empowered the moral force of his personality that causes him to be revered today and every day since his death as the great emancipator, and the man who persevered through the 4 most brutal years in our country's history to reunite the perfect union of our United States of America. I'll close with this thought that occurred to Walt Whitman in 1879. Why, if the old Greeks had had this man, what trilogies of plays, what epics would have been made out of him. Thank you.